June 16th, the structural modeling additional session. Kevin Dye will be talking about the additional components and more about the playbook and the implementation of these interactive management techniques. So take it away, Kevin.
Okay, hello. Welcome to our monthly dialogue about structured dialogic design, structured democratic dialogue, and the pragmatic or implementation side of things like interpretive structural modeling. So today, the last few months, we've been talking about a new publication that's going to be coming out, which is codenamed the SDD Playbook, or the Structured Democratic Dialogue Playbook.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Oops. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the interpretive side of structured dialogue and interpretive structural modeling. And that is in the meetings that we've had hosted by Joe, we've mostly talked about the logic and the math, about generating structures, usually based on dialogue, but not necessarily, can be used by individuals. But when you implement interpretive structural modeling, the interpretive side comes out after the structure is done, primarily. That's what I think the original intent. I'll ask Joe what his impression of the word interpretive meant. In my reading of Warfield and Christakis' work, you did structural modeling. Then after the structure was done, they had a structure interpreter. There's actually a document where they named a role. It was called something like the structure interpreter or the pattern interpreter. And that's where I think the word interpretive structural modeling came from. But it might also mean the interpretation that people have in dialogue when they talk about specific relations within an emerging structure. Do you have any insight on that, Joe?
That's really interesting, Kevin. I'm as a kind of a major other point I've been working with has been working with John Aubrey on his work with Charles Sanders Peirce. And of course, Peirce always had, instead of didactic, two-way relationships or didactic relationships, he had three-way relationships, which included the interpreter. So it seems to me, anyway, in my recent discussions and looking at how this structure could be formed, when we're looking at a structure that no one individual interpreter knows, what you really may be doing in large group activities is you may be creating an aggregate interpreter. And so that the whole group then becomes the interpreter. And what you're doing is, because you're aggregating all these different points of view into a single interpreter, then there seems to be a reduction in the amount or the type of attributes and characteristics that can be agreed upon. So you really narrow down the pattern basis for the interpretation. And so for the structural interpretation then of a large group that has been formed into an individual interpreter, then the idea, in my mind anyway, it looks like that they just started with the idea of, oh, here we have a structural interpretation. We're hoping to take that and look at behavioral interpretation and other types of interpretation, but that's my current view of that.
Yeah. Okay. So in any case,
Kevin, excuse me,
yeah.
Kevin.
Hi, Janet.
Hi. I think it's helpful to combine what you and Joe are saying, that there's interpretation as the structure is in the dialogue. There's interpretation going on in order to generate the structures, which then are again, manipulated mathematically, logically, and then again interpreted on the, once they have been derived. So I think it is helpful to keep interpretation for both of those, and in both cases you have this aggregation question as well.
Yes, and there's another aspect to it, which is at least in the way the methodology was articulated by Warfield in the 80s. After the structure or pattern was created, then someone would add the interpretation. Sometimes it was a facilitator. Sometimes it was someone that had domain expertise that knew how to read structures, and they would do the reading back to the group of what they thought it meant. And then something we started in the late 90s was we used some techniques from improv theater, and we would work with small groups of people that were subgroups of say we had 36 people in the dialogue. We would work with groups of 5, and we would tell them, how to read the structure. Typically, in a Warfield approach, you read the structure from bottom to top because all the arrows are pointing up. And we just tell them how to read it, and we would give them a few examples, and then we would ask, we'd have them talk about it and what it meant to them, and if they thought the pathways through the structure were meaningful as a group. And then we'd ask one of them to stand up with a projection of the structure on the wall and do a reading of it to the larger group. And we would give them a very short time to prepare this, so there was a lot of pressure, and it was always at the end of a meeting, or at the end of one structured session, and they're either waiting to go to lunch or they're waiting to go home, and so there's some adrenaline going, and it kind of promotes some creativity, and so there's this other mode where not only are the participants collectively incrementally developing interpretation as the structure emerges, but we also have people collaboratively develop an interpretation, which is presented back by someone. And sometimes we'll get the whole group doing things. So one person will be using a laser pointer to guide the larger group through the structure. Another person will have their hands on the wall where the different ideas appear in the different similarity clusters. The other one's talking in front of everyone, and if they wanted to write something or draw something, another one's on the flip chart. And so there's this a collaborative interpretive mode as well. And we used, as of the 90s, that was the most advanced way that anyone was doing interpretation, is to have these little collaborative skits. At that time, we'd ask who, for example, who's going to play Vanna, Vanna White from the Wheel of Fortune, and present the ideas on the wall. And we made it fun. And that's just another aspect. Now, since that time, we learned other things about interpreting the results of people's work, not just how to read the structure. And so this is something that what I'm presenting today in this graph that's in front of you, I'm going to tell you what it means to some extent and invite some commentary about it, is to compare two aspects of a structured democratic dialogue event. One is when people vote on what they think is important. And the second is what they determine to be influential through interpretive structural modeling and development of a structure. So structured democratic dialogue typically starts with a presentation of a triggering question that's preceded by several months of some investigation and development of a white paper which arrives at the triggering question. People are posed the triggering question, they respond to they generate ideas in response to the question, they share their ideas, then they clarify them, and then they either vote on what they think is the most important, which is following the original nominal group technique, or they go on to cluster things in terms of similarity, and then they vote on what they think is the most important. Excuse me.
Call from.
Hold on. Yeah. What you see in the purple and blue, the purple and blue lines are votes and weighted votes. Now this graphics from the 90s from a project with the Food and Drug Administration called the Good Review Practices Initiative. The Food and Drug Administration had a something called the Good Manufacturing Practices, which is like best practice when that was in vogue in the 90s. Things like total quality management came into healthcare, and kind of a parallel thing was called best practice. And so they had good manufacturing practices, which was a response to some congressional investigations of problems at the FDA. Then there was another round of investigations that had to do with the upfront process of the FDA in the review, when they were reviewing new drug applications. And so this dialogue had several dozen people involved to develop a structure of what to do to create this whole new regulatory regime called Good Review Practices. And at the time in the 90s, when we had people vote on what ideas they thought were important, we had them select the top 5 things out of typically could be 80 to 300 ideas. They picked the top 5, and then we'd ask them to rank those 5. And so from the rankings, we were able to do a weighted vote as well as a regular vote. And we studied, we did that, went on for like 15 years, voting like that. And I don't remember which is which on this diagram. Oh, here it is. The purple is a weighted vote from the second round of voting, and the blue is a weighted vote from the first round of voting. And Christakis he never actually compared this before I joined him. And after he looked at this for several years, he decided to stop doing 2 rounds of voting because they seemed to overlap almost completely in every case. I thought that was a mistake because you lost the ability to track the incremental learning of the of the participants, but that was his decision. So now there's just one in his practice, and everybody that follows him started doing one round of voting. So you don't see diagrams like this anymore. Now the blue, the dark blue, if you look up at the number 70 on the left-hand side, these are the influence ratings of an idea. So if you can imagine a network structure, a directed acyclic graph to be more specific, the things at the bottom, if all the arrows are pointing up, the items at the bottom influence more other ideas, and those would appear with the highest influence. Excuse me. So on the left-hand side, you see that there's 4 ideas that influence 70 other ideas. And then the horizontal axis is sorted in terms of influence. So things with the highest influence appear to the left, and the lowest influence.
Are you there?
Yeah. Did I fade out?
For some reason, I'm screen sharing. Let me try to figure out why that is, or how to get off of it.
Kevin,
darn it.
Kevin seems to be gone. There you go.
So the dark blue, which starts at the number 70 on the left-hand scale, is the assessment of influence of ideas on the network of ideas. So in this structure, there's 4 ideas that influence 70 other ideas, or 70% of the other ideas. I'm not sure what the legend was here. It's about 20 years ago. And the influence scores are sorted in terms of influence. So they go from highest to lowest, reading from left to right. So you see they come down, then they kind of plateau a little bit, and then they go to 0. Okay. So about 20 years, I've been looking at I've been doing some qualitative data research of influence in votes, which hadn't been done before, and sorting it different ways and looking. And the pattern that I saw is that there's this plateau of influence across the structure. You have usually 2 to 4 ideas that have at least double the influence of anything else in the structure. And then there's a middle region, which is kind of has a moderate amount of influence, and also something not shown here. They tend to have a moderate level of dependence. So they're things that are kind of intermingled in the structure. They typically appear in the center of the structure. And then the top half of the structure doesn't influence anything. They're just influenced by other things. And this is where the term erroneous priorities came from. That if you look at where the weighted votes, or just the voting on importance, appears, the highest votes on importance tend to be in this plateau region of influence, and it's almost never, maybe only 5% of the time are importance votes aligned with influence ratings. And so the idea of the term erroneous priorities is that when people do group work, they typically only use voting as their aggregation mechanism. And so people vote on their priorities, and that's how they assign their budget. But if that's how they assign their budget, they're pushing the money at the ideas that are highly intermingled, not the ideas that have a lot of leverage. In other words, if the structures that you're doing are about problems, for example, and you're wondering which problem to put my money after, just a voting mechanism without structuring will push your money at bottlenecks without pushing it at things that can leverage the resolution of the bottleneck. And that's kind of disturbing. And that's where the term erroneous priorities comes from. Is this difference between the highest influence items and the highest importance voting items. Pause here and we can have a discussion about this. We're now the last few years, we're doing a new analysis about this. We're trying to apply statistics across 100 cases. I don't think we've had a discussion about erroneous priorities before, have we, Joe?
Well, we talked about it a little bit, discussed it a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's, I think that my understanding and my impression from your description is that, first of all, the basic structure is an acyclic directed graph, or a directed acyclic graph, a DAG, that is starts from the leaves and it is directed up toward the root of the tree. So we're working from the leaves of the DAG and we're working toward the root, whether it's one root or multiple roots can be. And that there's a number of different, so this is the structure basically that we are analyzing here. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's the it's the structure. The dark blue is information derived from the structure, and the purple and light blue are information derived before structuring from the from just voting on what they think is important.
Okay, so now just for me to, when we, let's look all the way to the right there where you have the dark blue, or there's a whole bunch of zeros.
Yeah.
So that means, what does the zero mean in the dark blue? It has no influence?
Yeah, they don't influence anything else. They're either independent of everything else, or they're dependent on other things, but they don't have any influence.
Okay. That was okay. So are these the leaves of the graph? Or could they be?
Yeah, actually, the way you talked about roots and leaves is the opposite of how Christakis would say. He would say the things at the bottom are the roots and the tops are the leaves. But the tree metaphor is bothersome to me because trees don't have cycles.
Right. So
most trees don't split and come back together. And you see both things in these types of structures. But in general, as a loose metaphor, the things to the right with respect to the left-hand scale of influence, are what they would call the leaves. They would typically call the influential things the roots, because they like the Japanese total quality management metaphor of root cause analysis.
Okay, got it. Yeah, okay.
So they like, I don't like the metaphor of calling interpretive structural modeling root cause analysis, because of the problems I have with the tree metaphor. Because root cause analysis, according to the Ishikawa diagrams, or the so-called fish diagrams that were made popular in the 80s, are tree structures and they're not built for tracking cycles and splits and rejoins and things. But anyway, go ahead.
No, that's very, very good information. I'm just trying to slowly build the picture in my mind of kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Because this is data that analyzes the structure. If I could see the structure, then I wouldn't have to try to build it. But this is good.
Yes, apologize for that. I'm not on my computer, so I just picked up one of these diagrams that's on the web.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. I guess one of the things that I think is interesting is and it kind of it's related to the current work that I'm thinking about, but that is one is in the voting, is in the Wade voting. So this is where we're comparing or ranking these nodes, like one is more important than, less than, bigger than, better than, the voting thing. What are we voting?
Yeah, in most all the cases, it was voting on what do you think is your people are given 5 votes, and asked to select. Select is a little better term. Asked to select the 5 most important things. It tends to be called voting. It's not exactly voting, because voting you usually don't get 5 votes on something. It's a selection operation. But the other problem,
the 5 most important ones.
Yeah, the other problem with the word voting is that when we ask people if one thing influences another, we ask them to raise their hands and vote.
Yeah.
So the word voting is applied in both cases, and it's quite confusing. And that's a problem that was introduced by Warfield himself.
Yeah, it's okay. So I think the thing here, I'm beginning to get a better picture of this now. So I think that one thing's about influence, right, is we're not really asking, in this particular graphic anyway, it's my understanding, is we're not asking whether one node or one aspect, one object has more influence than the other. We're not rating and ranking objects' influence. What we're doing is we're just counting their connection within the structure, so that there appears to be 4 objects or nodes that are very influential, and then there's all these other nodes that basically are not influential at all. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. When we're asking people to select what they think is most important, we're not asking them. We haven't yet introduced the idea of influence, and so we're not asking them to predict what's influential. What I'm asking is, if you ask them to select what's important, is it predictive of what's influential? Because if it's not, that means budgeting practices that are based on selecting what's important doesn't guide the money towards what has high leverage.
Right. Okay. So now we have. So now we're just looking at the structure itself. So what was the triggering question that produced the structure? Does it matter?
The triggering question for this,
Could it be any triggering question? Are we just, do these techniques apply to all structures that are created on any kind of triggering question?
So far, something like 95% follow this pattern. We have a few structures where the importance voting is aligned with the most influential things. But some of those are a restatement. For example, the National Patient Safety Foundation project, someone restated the purpose of the meeting they were in at present. And so they said the most important thing for this project to do is to complete the next 2 days of work.
Oh, okay.
So everybody voted on that as the most important and influential. So I think, things like that are don't quite make sense. We don't throw out the data, and then there's sometimes the highest votes on importance appear at the far right of things that have no influence at all. And that's usually, when you look at the actual text, it's usually something that's an overall goal. And everybody agrees it's something they want to get to, but they know they can't start there, which is totally legitimate and doesn't fit the argument that I'm making here, but it doesn't happen too often.
Okay. That's good information.
Now, did you have another question about it? Or anyone else?
So I was just going to give other people an opportunity to speak to the people.
Yeah, I have a question. I want to make sure that I understand what you call a structure. So maybe I missed that part of the conversation in the previous conversations. But what you call a structure is from a set of questions or votes, what constitutes a description and a kind of a pathway forward to resolve an issue. Do I understand like the triggering or burning question, and then what are the factors that are the most important, then priorities and influences among different aspects that are actually voted into structure?
Yes, there's two classic types of structure in practice in this community of practice. One was named by Hassan Ozbakan, who was a boss of Warfield. He called it a problématique, invoking a French word that was coined by Lavoisier.
Okay.
And in that structure, the nodes are problems, and the relationship that's investigated is aggravation. So the triggering question may be, what are their problems with our project? In the graph that you're looking at here, we're looking at a second type of structure, which is these days they call it an action plan. Warfield called it an intent structure, but no one calls it an intent structure for the past 30 years, as far as I can tell. It's called an action plan. And in that structure, the nodes are actions, and the relationship is helps. So would action A help action B? Or would action A, does action A influence action B? Now we use help instead of influence because help is only the positive influence. Because in our models, we're not doing signed graphs, meaning we don't say, does it help positively or help negatively? Because that it's just not the practice. So we say help in the positive sense. And then similarly in the problematique, when we say, does problem A aggravate problem B, it's only 1/2 of an influence. Aggravate is the bad part of influence, right? Does problem A negatively influence or aggravate problem B? And so when you ask all the questions to a group are asked in terms of pairs. We say, does A influence B? Does B influence A? Does A influence C? And so forth. And for the chains of answers, which can create the ability for transitive inference, the computer answers the question instead of the people. So if the people say, problem A aggravates problem B. Yes. Does problem B aggravate problem C? Yes. Then the computer will say, does problem A influence problem C? Yes. And we don't ask the people that question. And that is what the algorithm is doing that Joe has been working on a new version for.
Okay, great. Now I understand. And so in one intervention, you can have both the problematic aspect that is put to vote or to collective construction, and the design aspect, like action. Or
Yes.
is it an either or? It's both.
In current practice, it's ideally both, and it's typically these days done in 3 days. They spend the first day and a half on the problems and the second day and a half on the actions.
Okay, great, thanks.
Just to give you some context, when Warfield was first developing this technique, he outlined over 70 types of relationships, including spatial planning. Is A to the left of B? Is B to the left of C? He had all kinds of types of applications that he called application structural types. But by the late 1980s and early 90s, he came to focus only on problematiques.
Okay.
And Christakis similarly came to focus on problematiques, but also action plans. Yeah.
So the action plan is also what they called an optionatique?
That's right. Some people use that term. Well, I've never heard that phrase. The first time I heard optionatique is from you, actually.
Really? Because I found that in some book of Warfield's.
That might have been one of his later books.
Maybe it was the Nkosi paper where he was laying out the challenge of developing system science.
Yeah,
I'll have
it could
to
be.
note that down and see.
I would guess that was one of his later things. Warfield loved to coin new terms.
Right.
Yeah, it's one of the things that can make literature reviews challenging, because he comes up with he'll do something for like 10 years and then change the name that he calls it. creating a discontinuity in the literature. And then you have two groups of people doing the same thing by two different names. And there's many instances of that in his work. And in particular, the word option, Warfield only ever used option to mean something like clustering. It's not quite just clustering. It was like clustering with sorting involved. And Joe touched on some of that when he was talking about quads and things, where Warfield talked about options fields and options profiles. And basically, the options fields were not really fields. They were kind of just clusters. And there's only a few writings where the fields actually has relationships built into the clusters. The profiles, if you select ideas within what he called fields, and he was using the word fields to mean what everybody calls clusters. No one calls them fields. No one sorts things on the walls and calls them fields. But he liked to always be different. And unfortunately, it's created people that are looking for some basis of what they're doing are disconnected from Warfield's literature because he kept using his own lingo.
Right.
I have another question if you're done, Janet.
Yes.
Yes.
How is it, how are the problems of the problematic and the actions connected? Because I understood that you test and you connect which problems aggravate which other problems. And then actions which help or not another action. Is there a kind of a mix between the two?
Yes. In Warfield's early work, he referred to that as interconnection matrices. He may have other phrases. Joe, do you want to weigh in on that phrase? In the later work by Christakis, he called it superposition.
Okay.
And then also the word, I think, resolution structures is another term. And no one uses any of those terms anymore.
So there's a number of application structural types that were defined. Some of them are difficult to find detailed information on. For an interconnection matrix, my understanding that when done at least one or maybe two events on a similar problem. So I created a structure A from event A. And I then took the same type of triggering question, and I did event B and created structure B. Then the interconnection matrix I could use to aggregate those two matrices without doing further, without doing a further type of event, because mathematically you could put it. From my look at that, that only applies to a very specific type of structuring a relationship. And so but the resolution structures and the intent structures, there's a way where you actually, it's shown in the handbook and in the Science of Generic Design, where you actually do an event and say, okay, these are our problems, and now how do we solve it? It's kind of a stepwise sequence where you build on different kinds of structures. And so logically it's different.
So maybe you're going to say something.
Yeah, I said it's interesting because there's this discussion in the pattern language around pattern languages about how valid is the fact to have encapsulated a problem with a solution. If a problematic is a combination of problems, does a combination of problem solutions solves a combination of the problems. So that's a topic that's an interesting one, and a discussion that I'd like to have in other communities. So thank you.
So Christakis is through CWA and what he called the Cognoscope software, did this mapping of actions to problems. But there's several other ways that you do it without software. One is you tell the group, we are now only going to consider actions that affect the things at the bottom of the structure, the things that are most influential. So if there's 4 ideas that are the most influential, we only want to hear about actions that will affect those. So you don't, because if you affect the most influential elements in the structure of problems, the actions that you're proposing are going to affect all those other problems if you focus on the 4 most influential. And then you can do that just by asking for any action that would affect those 4 root problems, or you could divide a group of participants into smaller groups and say, okay, group A, who wants to focus on problem 72? Who wants to focus on actions for problem 34? Who wants to focus on actions for problem 25? You have them work independently, and then you bring it back together, and you just place them manually on the wall, on the diagram, the structure that's on the wall. And that's actually faster than using the software, because if you're using software to look at the relationship of all of the problems to all of the actions, you have a combinatorial explosion of interactions that you are looking to accommodate. But the ones you're only mainly concerned with is which action should we take to have the most leverage.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's an interesting set of comments, Kevin, and I think it kind of points to our kind of a precursor is going to probably be the outcome of this next set of software that we do, because essentially in large group settings, I can find no justification for doing the pairwise type of analysis or pairwise questioning unless if you are not ranking. If human beings need to have that pairwise if they're creating some type of order, because they can't do anything. They realistically, that's what they can do. They can only do ordinal type of relations. And so if you're saying better than, worse than, bigger than, smaller than, then that's, as a matter of fact, you'll need to do the pairwise thing to place them in proper order. Or you're doing cluster. And that's clustering as a categorization or creating categories or sorting, like you said. So those two, I think, are probably pretty straightforward and very solid applications of that type of software. When we're talking about things like functions, like impacts, influences, causes, things like that, we're not talking about order. We're not asking people to put things in order. We're just asking them for knowledge. They're just polling the group and saying, is this true? Do you have this knowledge? Like, does A influence B? What you can say is just what influences A, or what influences B, because the group is right there. It's a concurrent type of communication to the whole group. You don't need to do it in sequence because they already know. You can ask one question: what impacts A, what impacts B, what impacts C, and they can give you that information. You're not asking people to rate and rank those. So those are the types of things that looking at now, and as you point out, by just asking the question to get the knowledge from the group, not asking the group to rate or rank things, then that can be much quicker type of way to get the information than going through doing the pairwise questioning. And the pairwise questioning really doesn't, this, logically, I can't figure out how it applies. So that's interesting.
Another aspect, especially in the action planning type of structuring, a group often cannot answer the question, the pairwise questions in the first in the first dozen questions.
Sure.
6 minutes each. Do you want to go over time as well?
Yeah. And what happens is this is information that came from tracking the dialogue during the structuring. What we found was they have to make a strong assumption that they didn't previously have about the context. And after the group makes about 6 such assumptions across the first dozen or so questions, the dialogue really speeds up. And so it's kind of like they haven't quite evolved. When you say you ask them something and they can just tell you what it is, they can kind of do that after the first 12, 15 questions, because they've finally decided what their context is, what their assumptions are. But often things are much fuzzier than that when they first begin the structuring dialogue. Right. So
of course, but what I'm talking about here is just the ability for human beings to rate and rank things. Human beings need to compare 2 things, right? To one against the other. They need to do that because they're not able to basically assign an ordinal value. That's kind of from utility theory. So we can see that if you're asking people to rate and rank things, which is one component of the structural modeling activity, then you need to use the pairwise part. The other part is when you're just asking them for knowledge, okay? So when you first start out, if their knowledge is fuzzy, then whatever that group learning is, this is an accelerated group learning technique anyway. And so that basically helps them and focuses the group on the specific things that they need to learn or think about or to make their basic assumptions, as you say, before they can answer the question. And as it goes along, then that becomes more and more refined, which is good. That's, again, a learning technique, because you would not want to do a situation like this and not allow people the opportunity to learn going through it.
Yeah. I think there's also an important difference between the mode, like the Cognoscope mode, the Christakis camp, where they use the software to pose the questions, right? Yeah. So they're only posing, does A influence B? Whereas in the matrix approach, which is very popular in India, where they just answer where they have the most knowledge. So that when you only pose, in the Christakis approach, when you only pose the pairwise question, it's biased towards asking questions that give you the greatest inference on the other relationships. Whereas when you just present the matrix, you give people the option to to answer where they're most confident about the knowledge they have, not the most inferential ability.
Yeah, that's really a very good insight. I think very important, Kevin, from the application standpoint. And what is beginning to appear to me is that that basically probably both of these approaches are, the computer-based one, the non-computer-based one, have their disadvantages, but I think there's a combined approach that's basically computer augmented, that uses the logical inference when the natural language relationship requires it. But then it's computer augmented in the fact that it can keep, you have computer algorithms that help you keep track of other information details that are going on when people are not being paid and ranked. They're just that can, as you said, a lot of questions, right? You don't have to do the pairwise thing only in certain cases. And because of the pairwise situation, you can design your system to maybe minimize the number of those that you ask. So with that, we're getting about 1 minute left here. Is there anything people would like to be presenting next paper? But we would like to have someone do August 4th. We'll plan on doing September 1st and November 3rd. We'd like, oh no, September 1st, right? We'd like to have somebody do October. We do, and then we'll do November 3rd, and then we'll do January. So we have been focusing on writing the papers and the reports and presenting them, but now I'm going to go back into software mode. So this be an opportunity for other people to prepare things that they're interested in, present to the group, and not bore everybody to death with the details of software. I'm sure everyone would appreciate that.
I think it'd be interesting to hear some of the insights from the patterns world.
Actually, looking at problematics in a more systemic way, because there's a big debate currently in some communities to say that there's a kind of a division between the analytical and problem finding or seeking aspects of things and the design and action and problem solving part of things. So I think you're onto something on how to actually bridge them together in a very solid, robust way. Some basic questions, and if I slow down the rhythm of your discussions.
Oh no, I think it's great because you know I get tired of talking to myself all the time.
Right. Sure, in this material because the terminology changes and different practitioners emphasize different things, and so one has to. You know, I think I have even more basic questions that I didn't raise because I kept cutting out on the Wi-Fi signal, but we're iteratively making progress here.
Yeah, because what I'm doing actually is trying to connect some dots on what's being done on this particular field.
But I think, you know, yes, you could add that in, but you could also see that that's part of discovery or part of design. Anyway.
Well, the actual contexts and way things, you know, combine. So it all revolves around similar interesting things. But thanks for this because it's an angle that I may, bring.
Okay. Well, we'll highlight the opportunities for people to present later on in the year.
Okay.
Of this July 7th, and we'll see everyone in July.